Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran, and it's wonderful to see you here with me in episode 69 of season 2. In the last episode, I left you with Kempe Gowda surveying the land before him on which he would build the Bengaluru Pete. In this episode, I will get into some more of the detail of how the Pete was planned. The building of the Pete marks the beginning of the urban history of Bangalore, and for this reason, we should try to understand everything we can on the subject. It is also a pivotal point in the history of the city. But first, let me pivot towards taking a moment to thank the Prestige Group, whose sponsorship makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. You'd think that telling the story of Kempe Gowda and the building of the Pete would be simple, given the number of people who've told the story. But in reality, this part of the city's history is deceptively difficult to reconstruct. Now, in today's episode, we are at that pivotal point, as I said, that matters because it represents the starting point of the city as we know it today. But it is a period almost entirely without reliable historical records. Epigraphical evidence, other than grants and records of public works, have almost always been about the emperors. Prashastis and other written records mention the entire lineage of a royal dynasty. But what is recorded about anyone else, if at all they are recorded, is sketchy and inconsistent. And then there is the problem that records that are not written down are usually told and retold in oral history and in literary expression, neither of which can stand the test of being reliable, much less verifiable, in records of history. Certainly true in the case of the Kempe Gowdas of Yelahanka. There is stray epigraphical evidence like inscriptions, some of which I have quoted in earlier episodes, that are available that point us to which Kempe Gowda did what in which year. But collectively, it's a little difficult. It's ironic that what is perhaps the most important part of the history of Bangalore is the least verifiable. And for this reason, when stories of Kempe Gowda are told, it is hard to tell fact from fiction. Nevertheless, the story must be told, and so we depend on different sources, literary works, oral traditions that were eventually written down, and there are two types of local documents that historians tend to rely on. One is called the kaifiyats, village or district summaries that have been prepared for administrators, and they often preserve older memories. Now, kaifiyat is from the Arabic loosely for how something is, the word kaif meaning how. Several oral histories are recorded in the kaifiyat. For example, one of them is the story of the Hoysala name, you remember, where the Jain Muni calls out to his disciple Sala to save him from the tiger. The only source of that story is from a kaifiyat. Another, from the kaifiyat, is the story of how the Kempe Gowda clan made their way to Nandi Hills from Kanchipuram. It's quite the story. Listen to the very first episode of this podcast where I tell it. The second are kaditas. Now these are handwritten notes or even event lists kept by village accountants or temple scribes. Again, typically these documents are reserved for royalty and the autocracy for their genealogy, but the kaditas also maintain other events. Now, individually, all of these records are fragmentary, so historians rely on the collective. So when several of these kaifiyats and kaditas point in the same direction, and when considered alongside the geography of what's being told, and also, in this case, what we know of Vijayanagara's political structure, they pretty much allow us to narrow down the context in which Kempe Gowda operated. It's close, but not all of it is necessarily true. I will therefore focus on those elements that can be firmly established: the land, the defensive environment of the land, the trade routes, and the political and economic conditions of the time that made the Pete feasible. And I will try to establish in as much detail as I can why it made sense to imagine a new urban center right here that eventually came to be called Bengaluru. When Achyuta Raya gave Kempe Gowda permission to build the Pete, it was only the beginning of the journey for one very easy reason. A Pete, a market town, cannot succeed unless traders choose to live in it. Now, traders of the 16th century Deccan were no different from the traders of today, all very practical people. They would not move their families, their animals, their goods, their apprentices into a new town merely because it sounded promising. They needed predictable routes, clear security, steady water supply, a hinterland that could feed and support the resident population of the Pete. So when planning the building of the Pete itself, its streets, markets, forts and localities, the first question Kempe Gowda had to consider was not really architectural. So Kempe Gowda understood that his task was not merely to build a town architecturally, he had to build confidence. And here, geography was on his side. Let's take a deeper look at this. One of the reasons the new town would succeed is precisely because it stood on the land that offered this stability, predictable access routes, and the capacity to support a resident community. From the beginning of time, and certainly now in the 16th century, the Bengaluru Plateau possessed a structural advantage that is often overlooked in the descriptions of Bangalore history, and these are the Navadurgas. Most Bangalore residents know the Durgas exist, Nandi Hills being the most famous, but very few understand the significance of these huge rock formations and how they influenced our history. The Navadurgas are essentially 9 hilltop forts that have sat sentinel over Bengaluru from the beginning of time. These forts didn't form a single administrative unit, neither were they built for a coordinated purpose. These were things that came up over a period of time, but together they shaped how people, goods, and armies moved across this part of the Deccan. Now let's identify each and every one of them. The northernmost of the Navadurgas were Channaraya Durga and Devanaraya Durga. Now they stood over the main corridors that descended towards the Tumakuru area and Sira. Close by to the north was Nandi Durga or Nandi Hills. The fort here appears in early Ganga and Bana inscriptions dating right back to the 5th century. At least there were descriptions of the hill itself. By the 16th century, Nandi Hills contained temples and gateways and water structures. That indicated a long-time administrative use. The position of Nandi allowed control over the pass leading from the plateau to Chikbalapur and further north. Close by to the southwest of Nandi Hills is Makali Durga, and this overlooks the approaches from Gauri Bidanur. Its location helped control the movement between the northern plains and the plateau's interior. Again, any movement from the northern Deccan towards the Mysore plateau passed close by to all of these Durgas. On the western side is Savana Durga. It's a huge, prominent granite hill that would have controlled traffic from Magadi and Kunigal. Now, Savana Durga, it is said, stands for the Durga of death. Savana in Kannada means death. It's because of its sheer drop. Even in the 16th century, its size and position made it a natural fortified point, and it was said to be impregnable, and it marked the western boundary of the Bengaluru region. Now southwest of Savana Durga were Hutri Durga and Huliyur Durga, which guarded the approaches from Ramanagara, Channapatna and the Kaveri basin. And then to the south, along the Kanakapura corridor, is Kabala Durga, overseeing the route linking the plateau to the Kongu regions, which are all now in present-day Tamil Nadu, and that's the area that used to belong to the Mysore kingdoms, which is now Coimbatore E-Road, historically very important for trade routes, and that is where one of the largest hauls of Roman coins were found. Now between all of these major forts is Bhairava Durga, which secured a smaller but a strategically relevant pass. Now although these 9 forts were not operated ever as a unified defensive system, their very presence shaped the region's behavior. So by the early 16th century, large-scale incursions into the interior of the plateau became very difficult because of these real mountains. Their movement was channeled into predictable corridors, maybe between the Durgas, and smaller raids faced these as natural points of resistance. So the Navadurgas were cast like a wide semicircle of defense that protected the Bangalore plateau from a lot of history. The result was that inside the semicircle was a level of stability that many parts of the Deccan did not have. And the stability is the first major reason a Pete could be imagined here at all. The next reason is trade. Now, trade routes reinforce this point. Long-distance movement across the peninsula didn't follow rigid lines. Routes changed over time. It was based on wars and floods, political turmoil, political arrangements, and also seasonal demands. But well before the 16th century, several major paths repeatedly converged towards the center of what was defined by the Navadurgas. From the north, the routes from Sira and northern Karnataka would have passed through the Tumakuru area and descended into the plateau past Devarayana Durga and Channaraya Durga. Now, from the east, the paths from Kolar and the old Gangavadi Tonde Mandalam corridor, and that used to be called the Periyavari, was approached through what is now Whitefield and Ulsoor. From the west, traders from Kunigal, Nagamangala and the smaller towns of the Shettihalli belt would have moved across the Magadi side under the watch of Savanadurga. And from the south, the movement from the Mysore country rose towards the plateau, and all this happened between Hutri Durga, Huliyur Durga and Kabala Durga. Because these routes were naturally channeled around or between the fortified hills, they all tended to spill out into the middle of the plateau. While I'm saying all of these things, you can just pop open a map of Bangalore and take a look at it, and you will be able to connect the dots as I did just now. Now, this pattern of trade converging in the middle of the plateau into this big area existed long before Kempe Gowda. He didn't create this convergence, but he took advantage of a convergence that geography had already produced. So this provided the second major reason for the idea of a market town on the plateau. It was realistic. Traders already passed through this region in significant numbers. The third consideration for the Pete was the land immediately around it. Now, the plateau contained several tanks already by the 16th century. These reservoirs, many were built under the Gangas and Hoysalas. They supported cultivation, ensured a reliable water supply even during the dry months. The site Kempe Gowda eventually selected lay close to existing water channels and had enough of a gradient to allow the extension of these channels into this new settlement. And all of this wasn't too difficult considering that it had been done for centuries before. But the traders who were candidates to resettle here would also have more practical questions. Could they enter and exit the town easily? Were the paths wide enough for all their pack animals and carts? Were there resting places, storage yards, warehouses, and convenient water points? Who controlled the roads? Who collected the dues? And the most important question of all, who was going to protect them? A Pete cannot exist without movement, and the movement had to feel safe. And to create that safety, Kempe Gowda needed to bring the surrounding tract firmly under his authority. Which brings us to Domlur, Ulsoor and Hesarghata, and all that right after this very necessary commercial break when I will tell you how Kempe Gowda annexed those areas. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Hello, I'm back. Let's get moving. Around the time that Kempe Gowda was putting the finishing touches on his business plan, there would have been a lot of troop movements across the region. In the early 1530s, Achyuta Raya's Vijayanagara was not the stage of triumph that it had been under his brother, but it was efficient, solvent, and importantly, self-assured. And cutting right across the Bengaluru plateau, he had conducted several campaigns to quell a rebellion. Then he got his sister-in-law married to his trusted general and carved out the entire Tanjavur district in Tamil Nadu and gave it as a dowry to the couple. And then there was peace again all over the peninsula. The important thing is that after all the uncertainties of the recent years, trade was moving freely again. From the western ports at Batkal and Honavar The ships from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf brought horses and coral. Across the plateau, caravans would carry all of these things, plus iron, grain, and textiles, into the Tamil country and the coasts. And the reverse is also true. Goods that came in from the Far East landed on the East Coast and found their way across the Deccan to the West Coast. This has been going on for centuries. The Portuguese merchants, who thought that this was going to be the decline of the south of India, found themselves once more competing for contracts. Inevitably, much of all of this trade would have passed through the Bengaluru region. So the first question was how to interpret what Achyuta Raya had actually granted Kempe Gowda. Kaifiyats speak of Kempe Gowda having received a Shankha Mudra, a rather a conch seal order, and this is entirely plausible within Vijayanagara administrative practices. Now these permissions were typically brief. They did not contain detailed instructions. They conveyed the legitimacy of the order rather than anything specific like logistical support, for instance. And they require the recipient, which is Kempe Gowda, to act within the limits of whatever the imperial expectations were. In Kempe Gowda's case, this meant two things. He could establish a fortified center, he could organize a market, but the revenues, the duties, and the rights that flowed from these would continue to flow into the imperial treasury. This actually was not a contradiction. Under Vijayanagara's delegated model, local powers often initiated these economic projects, while the empire got all the money. So temples, markets, and fortified settlements were regularly founded by feudatories or the Paligars. As long as tribute remained steady and political hierarchy was respected, they were allowed to do so. So when Kempe Gowda returned home with formal approval but no material assistance, he had to do everything by using local labor, local revenue, and local administrative structures. Now, the immediate requirement was sustainability, as we said before, water and food. A town could not be established if it strained or exceeded the carrying capacity of the land. A little earlier, I went over everything that the land needed. The first one was sustainability, water and food. A town could not be established if it strained or exceeded the carrying capacity of the land. So that had to be taken care of. Now, as mentioned before, the plateau already had a network of tanks, and they were all connected by seasonal channels and runoff lines, and that collected rainwater during the monsoon and distributed it equitably across all the fields. So the site chosen for the Pete was close to these channels, and new feeder lines could be dug when needed. Older ones could be cleared or widened or cleaned up. The slopes of the southwestern ridge on top of which Kempe Gowda set up the Pete made all this work predictable. The gradients were mild, the soil held moisture without becoming unstable, and the surrounding tanks could be tapped easily and reliably. Now this ensured that any growing settlement would have a daily supply of water for household use, for cattle, for basic crafts. It also meant that the surrounding fields could continue to produce the grains and vegetables that were needed to feed this resident population. Now, food supply, however, required more than water. It required control over the land and the contiguous territories that produced all this food and supported the Pete. And this is where Domlur becomes significant. In the 1530s, Domlur was not a small hamlet. It was an established agricultural tract with Chola-led investment, functioning temples, steady fields. Its proximity to trade routes made it important not only agriculturally, but for several administrative reasons. The absence of records of resistance when Kempe Gowda went to take Domlur suggests that this was more of an sort of administrative absorption into his Nadu than it was some kind of military campaign. With Domlur integrated, Kempe Gowda gained an uninterrupted stretch of territory on the eastern side of the plateau. Now the next concern was territorial coherence. If multiple small jurisdictions existed in close proximity, each one collecting its own duties, enforcing its own rules, and controlling its own little stretches of road, traders would be hesitant to relocate to such a messy place. So, Kempe Gowda's acquisition and consolidation of the land from Domlur to Ulsoor to Yelahanka to Hesarghatta created this cohesive zone in which he could manage movement and levy duties which were consistent across a reasonable amount of land. Reduces disputes, simplifies taxation. It allows him mainly to present the Pete as a predictable environment. But it also improved physical communication with the overlords in Vijayanagara. The empire's revenue system worked best when each feudatory delivered a clear and uniform book of accounts. Now, once this territorial coherence was established, Kempe Gowda could turn to the question that determined whether the traders would come at all, and that was safety on the ground. So that next necessity was security. This was important because threats on the plateau were continuous. Large bandit groups operated along long-distance routes, especially near water crossings and thick vegetation. If you recall from earlier episodes, this is why the Cholas, who were very trader and merchant friendly, had in fact created an entire division of an army called the Valangai Senai, which had outposts along all the trade routes to protect all the trade from these bandits. So that was one problem. The other problem was, although less frequent, small detachments from rival kingdoms around the Vijayanagara territory sometimes tested the border areas to see if they could disrupt the revenues of Vijayanagara and generally cause some trouble. But these could also be from rival Palegas around the Kempe Gowda Nadu who might damage trade to embarrass or weaken Kempe Gowda. This did happen. So in this environment, traders would have calculated risk more carefully than they would the opportunity of being in a central place. So the new town would not attract merchants simply because it promised infrastructure. It would attract them only if Kempe Gowda could demonstrate control. The Navadurgas ensured that sudden large-scale incursions into the interior were rare. The main corridors were stable enough not only to predict movement, but it also set up a security. Now this baseline stability made it possible for Kempe Gowda to consider, reasonably, adding a fort, a fortified center, to solidify his control over this region. Before he could raise any walls inside the Pete, Kempe Gowda also needed to make sure that he had a standing guard and a standing army. A Pete required watchmen, patrols, men capable of responding to trouble along the roads, or police within the Pete itself. Now, Kempe Gowda's new domain now included Domlur, Achyuta and Ulsoor, and this gave him the capacity to show this sweep of territory. And not only that, all of these places were also important access points in and out of major trade routes. So this question of security brings us to another important constraint of imperial policy, and that is Kempe Gowda's fort. Now, it is important to be clear as to what a fort meant during this time. A fort was not a small enclosure or a set of walls around a palace. It was a large, enclosed landmass. It was very often the size of an entire town. It contained barracks, storage houses, granaries, wells, armories, temples, and even open grounds for assembling troops. A properly planned fort could garrison several hundred soldiers, if not thousands, depending on its size and the needs of the region. But it also served another purpose, a civic one. In times of trouble, a fort had to be capable of taking in the entire population of the Pete. The walls were not merely defensive barriers, they were the boundary of a secure refuge for traders, craftsmen, laborers, priests, their families, and a fortified market town, therefore, offered the degree of safety that a cluster of villages could not. So for a trading community handling valuable cargo and large volumes of coin, the presence of a trained military garrison inside a defensible enclosure was a significant attraction. Now, I will address the internal structure of Kempe Gowda's fort in later episodes, but for now, it's enough to understand that a fort in the 1530s was a military and civic space combined, a place built to withstand attack, shelter a population, feed them, and maintain continuous administrative functions even when the surrounding regions were unsafe. As you know from earlier episodes, even as early as the mid-6th century, Pulakeshi had built a fort in Vatapi which had hard-to-navigate roads leading in that could slow down men and horses, let alone an entire army. That fort was said to be impregnable simply for the reason that access into it was very difficult. For another example, in medieval England, access between floors of a castle or a fort were by circular, spiral staircases, and these spiral staircases were built twisting clockwise up a central turret. And the reason it twisted clockwise was to hamper invaders with swords in their right hand. Now, right-handed swordsmen vastly outnumbered left-handed ones, so as these soldiers ran up, they could not really deploy their swords in their right hands because they were too close to the central turret. The Vijayanagara kings themselves were masters at having conducted lengthy campaigns on the Raichur and Udaygiri forts, just to name two. Maybe that is why Vijayanagara policy evolved that Palegars were only allowed to build mud forts. They could not build forts in stone. A Portuguese chronicler in the mid-16th century wrote that the kings of Vijayanagara did not allow local chiefs to build stone forts without explicit approval, and these stone forts would be approved only if such forts were being built on the outer periphery of the Vijayanagara kingdom. Now, he was told that this was because they feared a stone fort might suggest a readiness for revolt and make it very hard to bring down a wayward Palegar. A mud fort, however, was regarded as a functional defense structure. It was good for the time being, and it was consistent with loyalty, and they felt that this was good enough. So, Kempe Gowda's plan had to account for a mud fort, not a stone one. And this initial fort would eventually evolve into a stone fort later in the hands of Hyder Ali, but Kempe Gowda had to build it with all the limitations set by his overlords, and this fort would go on for centuries to become a focal point of contention and desire for wave after wave of attack from different dynasties. And today, when you walk through the Bengaluru fort, which exists, all of this history can sit on your shoulders. And there we have it. All plans in place, all approval secure. All that was left was for Kempe Gowda to break ground to build the Pete and change history. In the next episode, we will turn to the construction of the Pete itself, the layout, the grid of the streets, the placement of the markets, the occupational quarters, the temples, the fort, and the mechanism through which the town became a functioning center of trade and administration. All of that coming up in episode 70, and I can barely wait to bring you all of those tales of the first buildings of the city of Bengaluru. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.